Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Lucinda Rouse.
And I'm Emily Harle. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings on in the charity world. This week we'll be asking how charity leaders can demonstrate bravery in their approach to tackling diversity, equity and inclusion issues in a meaningful way.
Yes, indeed. And we're recording this episode a week after Save the Children UK published the findings of an external review into anti-Muslim hatred and anti-Semitism within the organisation, as well as pointing at the inability of senior leaders to deal with offensive behaviour in this respect. The reviewers said that the charity's DEI programme is not developed well enough to even begin to tackle the issues. This certainly isn't the first charity to have received such a damning verdict into their DEI approach, and it's unlikely to be the last. So how can charity leaders make sure they engage with these issues in a way that is both meaningful and effective, especially when they themselves don't have lived experience of them? We're delighted to be joined for this discussion by Louise Harris, currently Chief Operating Officer at the homelessness charity Crisis. She's held senior operational roles at a broad range of organisations, from Akivo to Amnesty International UK and the Centre for Ageing Better. And she started her career in accountancy. Hello, Lou.
Hi, nice to be here.
So first things first, what does brave leadership in furthering diversity, equity and inclusion look like to you?
Brave leadership is hard. I'm not an expert in this work by any means. I'm just someone who spent a lot of time working in the sector, care really, really deeply around how to create organisations where people can thrive and really have a passion for doing this work well. And as a Black woman as well, it's personal. So for me, having experienced marginalisation, discrimination throughout my life, throughout my career, it kind of creates the drive to want to do this work well. But that still doesn't mean that it's easy. Actually, in some ways, it can make it quite hard. It requires, for me, emotional intelligence, honesty, vulnerability. Some of the best leaders I've seen working in this space are ones who are willing to recognise what they know and what they don't know. And particularly when you're looking across the spectrum of marginalisation, even if it's something that you don't personally experience, how can you bring that level of not just empathy, but drive to make changes in an area if it isn't something that you personally relate to? I think for leaders, there's something in the ability to really connect and understand what you need to do within your organisation, acknowledge what you do and don't know, and then have that real goodwill and bravery to be willing to learn and try. And I've been inspired by leaders I've worked with who have stepped into really challenging spaces with the openness of saying, I'm here to listen, I'm here to learn, and I'm here to make things better. What do I need to do? And in organisations, that can be really hard sometimes because the challenge is that the burden is then placed on those who have experienced the issues or experienced discrimination to solve or provide the answers. And that's not necessarily the case, but it is a recognition that the best leaders are the ones that recognise that it's a collective organisational challenge. And how do you bring an organisation together to think through, if we want to be more equitable, if we want our people to thrive, actually, what do we need to do together to do that?
Absolutely. And can you tell us a little bit more about your experiences of having those uncomfortable conversations about DEI at a leadership level?
When I found conversations most uncomfortable, personally for me, it's when it's on something that I feel very passionately about and you want others to understand. And I recognise that that's something in me as well. I think particularly in the organisation I'm working with now, like having the confidence that even if the leadership don't know all the answers, they're willing to learn and they're passionate about making the change. That's the piece that really helps. And I think where I have found conversations difficult in the past is potentially where there's leaders that don't really understand the issue or want to tackle it at quite a superficial level. And that's not to say they're not willing, but I think it's a recognition of the depth of the issues that you're trying to work through. So when you're thinking about tackling marginalisation or discrimination, it's big, right? These are systemic issues. Our society is built from colonial systems where things like racism, misogyny, they're baked into our structures and systems and how we operate as a society. So when you're in an organisation asked to tackle anti-racism, it can feel completely overwhelming because you're trying to tackle something in a tiny part of a much bigger system. And so the things that I've often found useful are trying to step back and say, we understand that we're part of a big system that needs to change, but what actually are the things that we can do as an organisation? And that's not to say that you ignore that bigger system, but it's very, very easy for organisations and leaders, and I've found myself in this space, to just feel that the challenge is so overwhelming or the issues are so big that you got hope of tackling them? And actually there's something in the kind of starting small, taking the next best step, thinking what is it that we can do in our organisation right now to make the changes that we need to make. And leaders who are willing to try that are the ones that give me the confidence that actually we can make some changes.
One of the ways that charities can engage with DEI meaningfully is treating it as a strategic as well as a people issue, not relying on the HR team or the DEI team to instigate this organisational cultural overhaul. I understand this is something that you're spending a good deal of time thinking about at Crisis. Could you tell me a little bit about that work?
Yeah, I think it is very easy for organisations to, and I found myself in this space as well, to fall into the kind of, let's think about DEI as a people issue, let's create an action plan. And that's not wrong. And there are lots of things in organisations from a people and culture perspective that you have to get right. As I said, this is about creating spaces where people can thrive and do their best work, and therefore you have to make sure they're equitable. In our sector, we are a social justice sector, and we are working on kind of some of the most acute issues and causes that affect society. We know that homelessness discriminates. We know that if you're in a Black-led household, if you're from an LGBT household, you're more likely to experience homelessness than other demographics. And so for us, we have to see it as the change we want to create in the world, as well as the change that we want to create in the organisation. And how you think about it, not just as a kind of HR strategy, but actually this is part of us delivering our organisational strategy. If we want to really make sure that our strategy makes the shifts we want to make externally, we have to look at how we are internally. And for us at Crisis, one of the things for us is to be an equitable organisation, because we believe that that will create the conditions that we can do our best work as an organisation. We're on a journey, we've got a way to go, but I think it's really important that it is seen as part of our strategy, as opposed to a thing that we do on the side after we think about what our strategy needs. And so we've baked it into our values. We're doing a lot of work around what it really means to be an equitable organisation, and then working through what are the things and steps that we want to put in place to get there. And I think organisations that see it as part of an organisational strategy are the ones that have the best chance of success on a journey that is hard.
And what does that baking in process look like, practically speaking? Is it a case of having meetings and agendas specifically on this DEI issue when you're working on your strategy? Do you have other methods?
Well, things that I think I've seen and we're thinking through here, and I've seen in other organisations that help to do this, are having it as a clear outcome of the strategy. So it's really easy to think about your strategic objectives or priorities as being around the service you deliver or the activities you deliver, but also the culture you want to have, and having that as a clear and measurable priority that you're held to account to at an organisational level is one part, because that creates the conditions that it's recognised at the level of importance compared to other things you're doing. I think there's also something, and it's really hard, and it's a question we're holding in the moment, is how do you not just build it into the design of your work, but also into the way that you design the monitoring of your work. So one of the questions we're thinking about is actually, if we really want to bake in our equitable values into our work, we should also bake it into the way that we're monitoring our performance, so that we can think through a lens of equity in terms of how we're delivering the different parts of our work. It's really tricky, and the place we're in at the moment is thinking through actually where are good examples of this that we could learn from. There'll be lots of other examples in organisations of ways that people can really hold the accountability. That's the piece for me that's really important, is elevating this to a strategic level that is visible and that you are holding yourselves accountable to, is one step on the way.
And before we get on to going through some of those examples of really best practice in this area, I'd be keen to ask a bit about what role co-production can play in baking in DEI into your organisation's strategy rather than having it as that separate model. Do you explore co-production?
Yeah, and I've seen some really good examples in organisations I've worked in, and here at Crisis, we have lived experiences of really, really key foundation of our strategy. We build lived experience throughout our whole organisational strategy because we recognise that the best people to solve the issues are the people that are experiencing the issues, right? And have believed that throughout my whole career. And I think how we have many strengths and things that we do really well around how we design some delivery of our work is brilliant. And I think for us, we're thinking through what does that mean from a kind of organisational delivery perspective as well. Co-production, true co-production is really tricky. And I know lots of organisations grapple with the kind of ladder of co-production. It's always going back to the foundations of who are going to give us the best insights to solve the problem and who are going to give us the best insights to actually know, are we doing the right things? And if we're not doing the right things, how do we recognise that and do things differently? And that's where building lived experience into the design of the work and the delivery of the strategy is really, really important.
We started this discussion talking about leadership and how leaders can effectively address and tackle issues of discrimination, racism, etc. within their organisations. I wonder if you have any thoughts on how leaders can embrace issues that they don't necessarily have lived experience of. For example, if they're thinking about disability but have no experience of living with a disability, how can they effectively embrace those issues in order to generate a meaningful response?
I mean, what I said at the start about leaders being willing and open to what they don't know and willing to kind of lean into it and make change is really important. So I think that kind of curiosity and openness to recognise I need to do something, but I don't know how is the first piece. And then I think I can speak from perspective maybe of larger organisations. You will have staff networks, you will have data, use the tools at your disposal, whatever they are, to really understand how people are experiencing the organisation. I may not be experiencing this way, and therefore what are the assumptions I may be making about how everyone else is experiencing the organisation. But actually, if you can create the way, whether it's staff surveys, whether it's focus groups, whether it's engagement with networks, whether it's just, if you're a really small organisation, just having a way to have those conversations and opening your eyes to actually, this is what it feels like to be in the organisation for other people, for certain demographics of people, for people experiencing certain elements of marginalisation. That's the piece that I think is really powerful. I think it's very hard, as we all know as human beings. You naturally empathise or connect with things that are similar to you or you've experienced. And I think that's human nature. And I think we acknowledge that. But that's not an excuse to not be curious and make sure that you understand what's happening. And I think there are amazing practitioners in the space, in the sector, that have lots of different ways to be able to help individuals and organisations understand what's happening in organisations, to be able to then really step back and say, what are we learning? And then what do we need to do about it? And again, the thing that I've been so inspired by in organisations I've worked in and in crisis is the willingness, appetite, ambition, excitement of people within the organisation to also drive this change and engage and think about solutions. And I think leaders often can find themselves in spaces where they feel they've got to have the answer or they feel they've got to provide the answer. And I think that what I saw in the sector, particularly after George Floyd was murdered, was probably a lot of quite well thought through responses, not necessarily really galvanizing the kind of organizations behind to think about what do we do about this. And I think that's a real opportunity. And I see it in a lot of organizations. There's a lot of people passionate about this DEI work and want to make those changes.
And leading on from that point, how can these discussions at a leadership level, when it's tackling such big and meaty embedded issues, really grow into productive and successful discussions rather than being a turn off to leadership or just amounting to that sort of well-meant surface level action, but no sort of in-depth action?
It's very, very easy as a leader, I think, to need to go to action. And it's very, very easy to have a problem and want to fix it. And actually, what I have seen quite a bit of, and I'm actually part of the Akivo Further Faster programme, which is the anti-racism programme that they developed off the back of the Holmes Truth research that they did, is spaces for leaders to just reflect and learn. Because I think the rush to action to solve a problem, to answer a question, when you actually haven't spent the time to understand, actually, what do some of these things mean to me? what does white supremacy mean to me? How does it play out in our organisation? There's a lot of terminology that is being used at the moment. And I think it's great that work that's happening in the sector and outside the sector, great that people are becoming aware of histories of colonisation and white supremacy and white privilege, and all of these things are great in the anti-racism space. But I do recognise that also it can sometimes feel quite theoretical and academic and can be really hard for people to understand, but what do I do with this? What do I do here? And in the worst spaces and in the anti-racism space, people feeling that they can't have a voice or they can't get involved because actually if they come from privilege, they can't step into this space. And I think that leaders who properly take the time to understand themselves, what's happening, really care about recognising what is it that I can bring to this space, but what do I also need to recognise, and what are the things that I need to learn before I step into this work. They're the ones that actually I think will probably make the biggest impact. So I don't just think it's about the discussions that are happening in senior leadership team meetings or other things. I think it's about the work that leaders are doing to reflect on, how do I think about myself and how do I want to lead in this space? What privilege do I have that I can both lean into to support my organisation, but also have to recognise it can be a challenge, and how do I use that in the right way? That's why I'm really appreciating the Akivo programme, because it's creating a space for people to really reflect personally on their leadership and how they want to deploy their leadership in this work, rather than just necessarily jumping into the work. And that, I think, is really, really important.
I wonder if we could talk about a couple of examples now. You work for a large organisation, but there are many examples of small charities making real strides in their anti-racism and DEI work. Would you be able to tell us one that's on your radar that you think really demonstrates meaningful commitment and progress in this area?
Yeah, it's really hard to pick one. I mean, it's hard when you're not in organisations to really understand the depth of actually what they're doing. But I guess the organisations that, there's so many organisations working on space, particularly around disability rights, anti-racism. So I was lucky enough to be at an event with the CEO of the Disability Rights and was just so impressed by how he approaches his work, how he talks about his work. And when I see organisations that are in this space and talk to the small but big things that they're doing, it often makes me step back and think, how can we be more like this as a larger organisation? So there's so many benefits to being in a large organisation and working on DEI work, because we will have more resources, we will have more capacity. But equally, particularly when you're thinking about culture change, like being able to get everyone in a room, being able to, I just talked about getting to know your organisation. If your organisation is only 20 people, you can sit and talk to people and understand how they are experiencing things in a way that in an organisation of 800 people is very, very hard. So I think there is a lot that the sector can learn from smaller organisations who are doing some quite creative work around anti-oppression, around anti-racism and discrimination. And my challenge to myself is to think through, how can we just be a bit more agile and try things that may work or may not, but give us the opportunity to do things a bit differently.
On a slightly different topic, thinking about building diversity within the not-for-profit sector and within individual charities, what are your thoughts on the importance of mentoring for that, and how can it be done really well?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've just tried here, actually. We've started doing it. So before I joined at Crisis, there have been mentoring programs before, but not for a while. And then our women's network decided that they wanted to trial a mentoring program. It's one of the things that the network wanted to do, which I think is really, really great. And I remember thinking, when I heard about it, I was like, that's brilliant, but is that something that we should do it more broadly, not just in the women's network? And I think it's a little bit of the example of, sometimes you just got to get off and try some things. So our women's network have piloted a mentoring program that I'm part of, as with others. I think it's going really well, where they're kind of evaluating how it's going. But what's really exciting is that our race equity network is thinking, right, we'll see the evaluation and the insights from the women's network, and then we may want to trial something like this as well. And so I think any kind of program which allows space for people to really step back and think about their career progression, their development, what are the things that have brought them to where they are now, what are the things that they might want to think about in the future in their roles. So I'm sure the conversations in all the different mentoring relationships are really wide ranging, but I think it's really, really important to give individuals the space to have the support from someone that they feel will be able to understand them, understand where they've come from, may have a career history that they're quite interested in and think I want to learn from, or may have had life experiences that they think, actually, I'd really like to learn from someone who's maybe had similar life experience to me. And the more that organisations can create those spaces for people to learn and develop internally, the better. So I think mentoring programmes are a really good example of that.
We've covered a lot of ground there. Lou, I just want to ask you for your sort of final piece of advice for charities who are looking to take more of a strategic approach to their DEI work.
Ground it in your strategy. Lots of organisations are going through strategic reviews, looking at the future, like ground it in your strategy from the start, because then you've got it there. You've got something to work towards. And then be really brave. Like, this work is hard. It's quite messy. It's quite emotional, but really, really take the time to understand, what does your organisation need, where it is now, what are the things that will really make the shifts in the future. Understand what's happening in your organisation, understand how your people are experiencing your organisation, understand what's going on, and then step back and think, what does this all mean for us and where do we want to go? And create an ambition, but recognise that it's a long journey. I cannot think of one organisation that will be able to say, tick, done, we're completely equitable, we're completely anti-racist. It will never be true. And therefore, it's kind of, what's the journey we need to go on and how are we going to hold ourselves to account to doing the work? And I think that organisations that do that will make mistakes. They may go off course. They may have to deprioritise because other things come up. But ultimately, they'll get there if they kind of are really clear that it's critical to their organisation to be successful and for their people to thrive, and that they have the will. Then they will continue on that journey.
Some really great pointers to end on. Lou, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Lou, and that's it for this week. Next week, we'll be tackling the thorny topic of aid cuts, shedding light on the latest developments, finding out how they could affect UK charities, and raising questions about the very future of international development and aid. But for now, from Emily and me, and everyone at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producer is Till Owen.